Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing very well. So I just watched The Undoing. Let's talk about it. So The Undoing is a HBO series that was created by David E. Kelley and was also written by David E. Kelley, as well as Suzanne Bier, who also directed all of the episodes of this series. Now, she's also the director of a series that I very much enjoyed called The Night Manager from a few years ago. So I was super looking forward to seeing what she would come up with this time around. And I have to say that overall, I found this series to be quite engaging and very, very well executed. Now, before we dive into my thoughts, this is going to be relatively quick. I'm going to try and do this as quickly as possible because I'm not feeling too well still. I have been ill for the past few days, so we're suffering through this. But if it seems like I don't have the same energy that I usually do, then just know that is the reason, because I'm really trying here, guys. But for those of you who appreciate this video nonetheless, please be sure to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and make sure you turn on your notifications so that you can be told when I upload next. I also recently hit 800 subscribers. Now, considering how sick I am and just how nauseous I am, it won't properly convey how much gratitude I have for each and every one of you who have subscribed to my channel and just engaged with my channel. I very much appreciate it. Thank you so much. And now, without further ado, let's dive into this review. So The Undoing is about the character of Grace, who is portrayed here by Nicole Kidman, and she has her little family with her husband Jonathan and her son Henry. Now, they're a very wealthy upper class family, but it turns out that not all is perfect in the Upper East Side, because there's a lot of drama. There's a murder mystery at the center of this story, and one of the key suspects is Jonathan, Grace's husband, who turns out was having an affair with the woman who was killed, that being Elena Alvarez. Now, this series was especially interesting because it wasn't just about the murder mystery aspect. It also centered around the character of Grace and how the world that she had built, the world that was surrounding her, came crumbling down because slowly but surely all of the things that she believed to be true about her life, and in particular about her husband, turned out to be untrue. So that's kind of the undoing that is alluded to in the title here. It's the undoing of the perception of Grace's almost perfect life. It's the undoing of all of the work that she has done to give herself this life and to provide this life for her son. And it's also the undoing of the perception of Jonathan himself as this perfect angel of a man. He's a doctor who treats children with cancer. You know, his character profile on paper seems so irrefutable. It seems so perfect that it seems as though, even though the circumstances are right for him to have done the murder, it couldn't possibly be him because he just doesn't fit the regular profile for a murderer. And so the undoing of that perception of this character is also central to the themes of this series, and that again refers back to the title of the series itself. He just ends up losing a lot of that trust and losing that positive perception that people have of him, despite the years and years of work that he has done, because of that snap moment where he ends up murdering the woman that he was having an affair with. And yes, in the end, he was the murderer. That was the subject of the murder mystery. Now, here's where things get a little bit tricky. I never believed that anyone else was the murderer. I never for a second thought that anyone else was the murderer. I knew it was Jonathan. Like, I know that the whole point of this series was that you were supposed to second guess, and in a lot of the episodes, because it was a weekly series, they ended off with a cliffhanger that would suggest that perhaps Grace had done it, or maybe even Henry had done it. I personally, and I may be in the minority here, but I personally never thought for a second that it was anyone but Jonathan. I didn't trust Jonathan in the slightest. That's not to knock Hugh Grant's performance in this series. We'll get into the performances later on. But wow, wow, absolutely incredible. That's not to knock his performance in the slightest. But in my mind, this read very Jekyll and Hyde to me. This was very reminiscent of Robert Louis Stevenson's The Curious Case of Jekyll and Hyde, where you have a very similar situation. You have this doctor, even, who was very highly regarded in his community, you know, the upper class community, the upper echelon of society, and yet despite this very respectable persona and all of his accomplishments and how much respect he had in the society, he still wanted to live out an alternative lifestyle. He had an alternate side to him due to the duality of man that was just more primitive and aggressive and mean and horrible. And Dr. Jekyll wanted to live out those two sides of him instead of having to constantly repress the side of Mr. Hyde, and so he ends up creating this potion where he divides the two almost, and he ends up manifesting Mr. Hyde as a result of that. And Mr. Hyde can get away with, doing whatever he wants, or so he thinks, because Dr. Jekyll's reputation will remain intact as an entirely different being almost. And we definitely see a very similar thing here with the case of Jonathan, who's living these two lives where he's able to, live out the perfect fantasy of this family that he has with his perfect wife and his perfect son who goes to this perfect private school. But then he also has that other lifestyle that he's living in secret and in shame, where he's started a relationship with the mother of one of his child cancer patients, and that relationship has ended up being rather messy, to say the least. I think it's really interesting to see that what triggered the series of unfortunate events is the fact that Elena actually wanted to have a bigger role in Jonathan's Dr. Jekyll side of his lifestyle, and that's something that he was very reluctant to give over because he wanted to have those separate elements, those separate entities. And I feel like the reason why he was so angry at her suggestion that she would start, interacting with Grace and become close to her, and they would be one big happy family because he would never leave her, is because he was very strict about having those two elements of his life be separate, as well as the fact that, of course, he didn't want Grace finding out that he was cheating on her. But there is also that, Jekyll and Hyde duality playing out there, and I think that's why he reacted in such a violent way specifically. Now, actually, I thought that this side of this storyline was the most compelling and most interesting. The idea that we have this Jekyll and Hyde character be explored in this murder mystery, I found to be more compelling than the murder mystery itself. And for the most part, that's because I never believed that the murderer was anyone other than Jonathan, even for a second. Like, truly, I didn't believe that it could be Grace. I didn't believe that it could be Henry. Certainly not. I truly thought that it was Jonathan the entire time. Apart from when some people were speculating that it could even be Sylvia, who's Grace's friend, her lawyer friend. I thought she would have a bigger role to play in the series than she actually ended up having. And I did actually think that Sylvia had been the other person that Jonathan had an affair with. I pretty much thought the whole time that it would be Jonathan, and he was just trying to evade blame by charming everyone. And second point to the reason why I didn't find the murder mystery that compelling, I never found him to be that charming in the first place. I didn't find him to be that charming. Maybe it's because I'm a Londoner and I don't trust anyone, but I didn't trust him, even if it is Hugh Grant. Like, I didn't think that he was that charming. So much of a big deal is made about how charming he is, and I think maybe it's because they're American and he has a British accent, so they're like, oh my god, like the charm. But I didn't trust him in the slightest. I personally found the more compelling side of the story to be this dichotomy between the Jonathan who existed in this, fancy Upper East Side life versus the Jonathan who had fallen in love with this young, poor mother to a very sick, or previously very sick with cancer son. Another reason why the murder mystery itself wasn't the most compelling to me is because I felt like the series chose the wrong heroes for me to follow. I think they tried to vilify Elena's husband, where I feel like that was a mistake. If they wanted to focus on the murder mystery itself, I think the more compelling character to focus on would have been Elena's husband, because I actually felt bad for him. I didn't feel as bad for Grace or for any of, that family, certainly not considering how many resources they had at their disposal. I mean, we just see the privilege upon privilege upon privilege of these people. The fact that not only are they a white upper class family that have great education behind them, they have a great reputation behind them. Then you also have Donald Sutherland, who's just this mysterious millionaire, seemingly. Like, he seems to have so much money, so it never really feels like she's at a great disadvantage. And that was my issue with the whole murder mystery side as well, is that we're supposed to be following Grace and we're supposed to be following her journey at finding out that the life that she had built for herself with her husband was crumbling down around her because he had been lying to her and he wasn't the man that she thought she'd married, because he presented herself as the ideal husband even though that wasn't who he actually was. And that side of things, that's somewhat compelling, especially because she's a psychologist herself, and the fact that she wasn't able to see that is interesting because he seems to be her blind spot. But again, we're focusing on people who have so much privilege. They're able to get the best lawyer in Haley Fitzgerald, who, by the way, I kind of hate the fact that they kept that name from the book, apparently, because they have this black actress portraying her. She's a great actress. I remember seeing her in Black Earth Rising, starring Michaela Cole earlier this year. So I think she's absolutely phenomenal. But I think think they should have changed her name to something black sounding. Why are we still doing this thing where you're casting a black female actress and you're calling her Haley Fitzgerald? Like, you're keeping the name Haley Fitzgerald. That's ridiculous. That makes no goddamn sense. How is her name Haley Fitzgerald? Anyway, Hollywood loves to do this. Like, it loves to erase all blackness where possible. So that's my issue. And if your answer is like, oh, that's her name in the book, perhaps that's the case. But they did change the name of Elena from Malaga, so they could have changed Haley's name as well. But anyway, this is a small point. The actress is amazing, and they got the best lawyer at their disposal to muck things around so that Jonathan could be defended at the best possible capacity. So it just shows how many resources they had at their disposal, and it makes it very difficult for me personally to root for them. If we really wanted to go down the murder mystery route, imagine if it had been from the perspective of Elena's husband, who doesn't have those resources. He's poor, he's taking care of 2 kids, one of whom is not even his. The daughter isn't even his child. Like, she's literally the product of the affair that has destroyed his life at this point. So I personally found his side of the story to be so much more interesting and compelling, and I personally found him to also be, you know, a character that I really had great empathy and sympathy for in this situation. So the fact that we were focusing on Grace and the fact that I was supposed to have that same empathy for her was kind of misguided in my opinion. But again, perhaps that's just because I kept seeing her as this privileged, you know, upper class white woman, and it was very difficult for me to buy into the fact that she was the victim here, especially when she chose to support Jonathan, even though he was the main suspect of a murder investigation. Now, when it comes to the performances, as I mentioned before, I think Hugh Grant was absolutely incredible, especially in the final episode. In the final episode where he is driving with Henry, and Henry is absolutely terrified. We'll talk about Noah Jupe in a second. But when Henry is absolutely terrified to see his father behaving in the way that he is, and you juxtapose that against Hugh Grant's, you know, fake lightheartedness in that moment, oh, it's just a work of art, isn't it? Like, it's truly a work of art. I think he's highly deserving of any Golden Globe nomination that might come his way, or certainly Emmy nomination, because he knocked that out of the park, truly. And even though I personally may not have found him to be the most charming person, because I was suspicious of him from the beginning, I think perhaps the target demographic for this series, we'll just leave it at that, would definitely find him to be charming, and would definitely have been misled by a lot of the red herrings that this series drops throughout. So I think his performance here was absolutely phenomenal. Noah Jupe, Noah Jupe is talented. Noah Jupe is incredible. I said as much in my review of Ford versus Ferrari last year. He was also incredible in Honey Boy. He was also incredible in this. This guy is talented. This kid is talented. Wow. And again, especially in that final episode, are you kidding? I felt so bad for Henry. He had so much respect and admiration for his father, and of course, why wouldn't he? He was a doctor who treated sick cancer patients, kids who were suffering from cancer. Like, that's someone that you would look up to as a hero, no doubt. So the fact that he wanted to keep his family together was so understandable, even during these, you know, difficult circumstances. And the fact that Jonathan used that against Henry, and even went as far as to suggest that Henry had killed Elena, that made me sick. That's when I was like, you're dead to me. Like, literally, you're dead to me. And I think that was also the moment where Grace finally came to terms with the man that she had married and decided, you know, how to move forward from there. She woke up. She woke up at that moment. She was like, oh, you're blaming my son for killing? No, something's wrong. Now, speaking of Grace, here's the thing. This is very tricky. This is something that I was thinking about pretty much since the first episode of this series, and I don't know if anyone else has touched on this. I don't want to seem discriminative in any way, so I'm going to try and be as delicate as possible. I understand that when you're working in a vapid and very, you know, beauty, appearance obsessed industry like Hollywood, your appearance very much matters as an actress, especially as an actress because of sexism, okay? And, you know, actresses aren't allowed to age. They're expected to remain, you know, 24 forever until they become grandmothers, basically. And that's the only role that they will be made available to them at that point. So Hollywood is a very ageist, very sexist institution still. And I completely understand why actresses feel it necessary to get work done in order to maintain their looks for as long as they can. Plus, you know, some people just want to do that to themselves. Like, that's just their choice, their prerogative. But I do think that it does have an impact on actresses' performances. And that's something that couldn't quite leave my mind throughout the entirety of the series when I was watching Nicole Kidman act here, because I think, of course, Nicole Kidman is an incredible actress. Like, she's amazing. But I think the Botox that she's gotten, the fillers that she's gotten on her face, and she has indeed gotten them, if you haven't noticed, I don't know what to tell you. Look it up. But I could definitely see it. I have an eye for this sort of thing, and when I see it, like, it's impossible to unsee. I think the work that she has gotten done has prevented some crucial muscle movements in her face. Now, that's by design. That's what Botox does, is it prevents you from moving the muscles on your face that would create a lot of wrinkles, you know, and that's something that they don't want. They don't want a ton of wrinkles on their face because that's a sign of aging. But it's also a sign of living. And unfortunately, when you stop that muscle movement, especially when you're an actress, it becomes difficult to sell your emotions in your performance, and that's pretty crucial in my opinion. And so I felt like that was the case for the majority of her performance here, and you could see like she was trying, and I don't think the Botox has completely stopped any forehead movement. She has a little bit of movement, but like, for example, like this range, absolutely not. Like absolutely not. She could not move her face with the same range that I can right now as someone who hasn't gotten anything done. And I think, again, just as it pertains to her performance, I think this is crucial because it means that a lot of the emotional scenes that she has, I just don't buy. I think her face looks so frozen and it looks so emotionless that even when her mannerisms and her body language are selling the emotion at that moment, her face isn't. There's just such a disconnect there. I found it to be quite distracting. Anyways, I found her character to be somewhat lackluster, if I'm being honest with you. And I think that in terms of the murder mystery itself, I think it focused on the wrong person. I would have liked to see it told from the perspective of Elena's husband as opposed to Grace, who's in a very privileged position. Even if it does destroy her family in terms of her perception of her husband, other than that, it's like, she'll be fine. Like, she hops into a helicopter at the end with Henry. She's fine. Speaking of Elena herself, another issue that I had from the very beginning of this series, and again, I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on this one as well if you've watched this series, is the portrayal of this woman of color, this woman who comes from a Hispanic background, clearly, as being this very salacious, seductive, sexual being that no one really fully understands. She has an air of mystery surrounding her. She's portrayed as quite, hypersexualized and very, illustrious, and someone who, Jonathan just couldn't resist, essentially. Whilst at the same time she's poor, so she's someone that he wanted to save almost, like she's someone he wanted to give up everything for so that she could have a better life. She and her son could have a better life and better opportunities. So she seems to fit a very caricaturized version of a woman of color, and I'm not the biggest fan of that. I found that to be shockingly antiquated and her character to be quite two-dimensional. And again, I was expecting there to be a little bit more insight into, this mental illness that they propose she has. But no, instead it's just used as a reason for her to, kind of bitches be crazy, a reason for her to have wanted to insert herself into Grace's life. Like, she was obsessed with Grace. She was so obsessed with entering Grace's life and seeing Jonathan's, again, Dr. Jekyll's side of his lifestyle. Like, that's what she was so fascinated and obsessed by. And in the end, it didn't end up being a substantial element to her character in the slightest, because in the end, Jonathan still killed her. It was still unwarranted. It was still a heinous act of violence. So what does it matter that she had an obsession with Grace? What does it matter that she drew Grace with perfect detail? Like, why did any of that matter? Why did it matter that she showed up at Grace's gym naked and like kind of seducing her? Why was that necessary? It wasn't. In the end, it truly wasn't. And I did think that this character fed into that stereotype of this, seductress who's a Latina woman. Like, oh my goodness, you can't keep your hands off her. Like, her sexuality is fluid, and that's absolutely fine. But they don't really explore that other than to just suggest that Grace would be seduced by her just as her husband was, because she's just such a sexual being. And that's pretty much the only aspect of her character that they decide to even build, to even present to us as viewers. I found it to be quite dated. I found it to be quite stereotypical. It didn't really give her much of a personality outside of how she interacted with Jonathan and with Grace. And on top of that, you know, you have this environment where you have these, you know, upper class people, and the majority of them are white, except of course for Haley Fitzgerald, who's a black woman somehow. But then you have the poories, right? You have the poor Latin American people who are, you know, suffering, and the only reason why she's able to get her kid into that school is because she basically tricks Jonathan into paying for the school and stealing money from Grace and their account. It reads really filthy to me. Okay, the more I'm thinking about it, the less I like it. It reads very mucky to me. I'm not a fan of how they portrayed this couple. And again, it just feeds into my point that I think this story would have been far more progressive, far more nuanced if we've been focusing on the poor people, the people who weren't privileged and whose the justice system is actually working against. Why would I be rooting for someone who's going to be fine, who's literally going to be fine at the end of the series? And so with all of that being said, I'm going to be giving The Undoing a 7 out of 10. So that's it from me. Now that I told you guys my thoughts on The Undoing, it's time for you guys to let me know what you thought of this series down in the comments below. Please be sure to subscribe to catch new videos coming up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.